What's up, nerds? It's your boy walking to that magic store that gives us food in exchange for money. We haven't done one of these in a while. It's a lovely day. Probably gonna regret this, but let's talk about traps, specifically traps on doors, specifically whose job it is to go through the dungeon and reset the traps on doors. Because if you're running a dungeon, and if you're running a dungeon that has wandering monsters on the table, one of those wandering monsters should be replaced with the guy whose job it is to go through and reset traps. In fact, pretty much with the exception of things like slimes, or just things that are just there like giant insects or whatever, pretty much the entire wandering monster table should be patrols, guys out hunting, or guys whose jobs it is to maintain the dungeon. That goblin who has to go through and reset all the traps and relock all the doors. Because otherwise, why, if the trap only goes off once, then what? All right, so let's use typical door trap, okay? Poison needle. Poison needle, one and done, right? First guy comes up, turns the knob or whatever, needle goes in his skin, dead. All right, great. If he's by himself, trap was a success. If he's with a partner, well, not only does that partner have a chance to save them, but now the partner goes, oh, hey, there's a poison needle in the door. Just killed my partner there. Now I know it's there, which means now I can circumvent it because I know it's there. And what are the chances it's still poisoned now that it killed, my partner? And then he circumvents the poison needle trap, opens the door, goes in. Maybe he spikes the door open. Maybe he just leaves the door open. Then he's on his way. And a couple hours later, another group of adventurers go through. Or a wandering monster. And now, door's open. And there's a body laying behind it. Howdy. Or I don't know, maybe the door slammed shut or whatever, but still, that trap's already been set off. Which means it's never gonna be useful ever again. And anybody else who comes along, hey, look, there's a body lying by this door. It probably means there's a trap, right? So now I know to look for it, okay? And that goes for any trap, and they're all one and done, unless there's somebody who's specifically going through the dungeon whose job it is to reset them, Now, when modules are written, they're written with the idea from the outside in. From the outside in, we know, okay, once one group goes through this module in my game, what are the chances they're ever going to go through it again? So that's how we think, right? We think outside in. We don't think normally inside out. We don't think from the point of view of the guy who built the dungeon. And the guy who built the dungeon is either thinking, no one's ever going to come here, so why do I need to make traps? Or, yeah, people are going to come here, but then if one group of people are going to come here, more are probably going to come here, And we could use White Plume Mountain as an example of that. Carapace literally advertises, I stole all these things, come get them. He had to expect more than one group was going to come, right? So with that in mind, certainly there'd be people whose jobs it was to go back through and fix things if after the first group comes through, there's another group after them. And the writer of White Plume Mountain kind of explains that with adding that extra little room with Sir Bluto Sans Piat and his men, and you kind of get the idea that those guys' job is to go through and reset everything after the party of adventurers has been done. And that should be the thinking of any dungeon, all right? Because you need to think inside out. You need to think from the mindset of the guy who built the dungeon. Why am I locking this door unless it's to keep somebody out or to keep something in? Why am I putting a trap on this door? Do I really think throughout the entire history only one person's going to come down here and try and rob me and nobody else is ever going to come here? Obviously, if I went to all the trouble of building this instead of doing what most logical people do, I'm also going to go through the trouble of assuming that more than one person is going to come here. So, circling back to our original idea, traps and wandering monsters. Wandering monster table should be made up mostly of the guys whose job it is to go through the dungeon, reset the traps, move the bodies so the next group doesn't know that there's a trap, or leave the skeletons behind so the next group goes, oh, this is scary, let's not go down there because there's another bunch of bodies, you know. Fix anything the last party broke, repaint the walls after the fireball went off so the next group of tomb robbers don't know there's a fireball in there. Reset the fireball, because if that's not there and you run the same dungeon more than once, then you either have to remind yourself, oh yeah, that's now open, that room is now empty, or you have to run the dungeon from a living inside out point of view where, okay, enough time has passed, has something repopulated that room now that group A has died and group B is going through the same dungeon. Or C, you're just like, fuck it, you know, I have no consistency or continuity in my game. The room is exactly the same, even though I've run it for 3 different parties. And the first 2 parties knew, you know, the third party knows about the first party. Which is lazy, but that's basically how modules are written. Modules are written from outside in. Modules are written from the idea that's one and done. You're only gonna want one group in your world through the caves of whatever, and after that, nobody's ever gonna go back to the caves of whatever. And even if a year later, what if you're like, oh, a different group, and I want to run them through the caves of whatever? Do you remember that a year ago you had a previous group, or you just start from scratch? I've always tried, when designing dungeons, to think about, well, I'm gonna put a trap, who built the trap, and once the trap goes off, is there somebody whose job it is to then go back and reset the trap? I haven't succeeded at always, but it's always, you know, and as I get older, I think about it more, and I think about that. So I think, in closing, boys and girls, while you're designing your next adventure, and if that adventure includes locked doors and traps, why is that door locked? Why is it designed to keep something out? Is it designed to keep something in? Why is that door trapped? How come that trap only affects one person but not another people? Why is that body laying there unless somebody set off the trap in the past? Is there some guy on my Wandering Monsters list whose job it is to go through the dungeon and fix everything after the adventurers have gone through it? Just some random thoughts going through my head. Let me know what you think. What is the ecology of traps in your dungeon? And I'll talk to you later. Thanks for joining me on this walk.